From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
So we are extremely disappointed that the government looks like they're not going to reunify all the eligible children today, and that they have not even tracked down the removed parents.
The Trump administration's failed to meet a court-imposed Tuesday deadline to reunite all 102 children under the age of 5. The Trump administration separated from their parents at the border. They just returned 38 of the children. We'll get the latest. Then we look at President Trump's push to invade Venezuela, the political crisis in Brazil, and the anti-austerity protests rocking Haiti.
There's disorder in the streets. Public transportation isn't working. We can't get gasoline. Almost all of the gas stations are closed. We're in a miserable situation. If we're hungry, we can't buy anything to eat. We have nothing.
Then we go to Nevada, where the state's preparing to carry out its first execution in 12 years. One of the drugs the state will use to kill the prisoner? Fentanyl. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration failed to meet a court-imposed deadline Tuesday to reunite all the children under the age of 5 immigration officials took from their parents at the border, then sent to jails and detention centers around the country. Only 38 of the 102 children under 5 have been reunited with their parents, some of whom say their young children did not even recognize them at first after the traumatic, protracted separation. On Tuesday, Judge Dana Sabra of San Diego reiterated all separated children, 3,000 in total, must be reunited with their parents by July 26, saying, quote, "These are firm deadlines. They are not aspirational goals." Also on Tuesday, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar claimed the United States was acting generously toward the migrant children when they took them away.
It is one of the great acts of American generosity and charity, what we are doing for these unaccompanied kids who are smuggled into our country or come across illegally.
Protesters confronted President Trump's daughter Ivanka in Syracuse, New York, Monday, chanting, "Shame, shame," and "Do you know where their children are?" We'll have more on family separation after headlines. President Trump's in Brussels today for the NATO summit. At a NATO breakfast this morning, Trump surprised all by attacking Germany and lashed out at NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg.
But Germany is totally controlled by Russia because they were getting from 60 to 70% of their energy from Russia and a new pipeline. And you tell me if that's appropriate, because I think it's not. And I think it's a very bad thing for NATO, and I don't think it should have happened.
President Trump also repeated his demand NATO countries increase their military spending, which they'd already planned to do by 2024 in an agreement with President Obama. This is European Council President Donald Tusk.
First of all, dear America, appreciate your allies. After all, you don't have that many. And dear Europe, spend more on your defense, because everyone respects an ally that is well prepared and equipped.
After Brussels, Trump heads to Britain, where mass anti-Trump protests are planned in London, and then to Helsinki, where Trump will hold a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin, a meeting Trump says may be the easiest of them all. The Trump administration's threatened to impose 10% tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods, including fish, textiles, handbags, chemicals, petroleum, and other products. The threat comes after the Trump administration imposed tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods last week, prompting China to retaliate with tariffs against U.S. products. This is a spokesperson from China's foreign ministry.
I would like to stress that the United States' behavior is typical trade bullying. China will definitely make the necessary counterattack and firmly protect our legitimate rights and interests. I would also like to say this is a fight between unilateralism and multilateralism, protectionism and free trade, might and rules. China stands in line with the international community on the correct side of history to protect the rules of the multilateral trade order together.
The Trump administration's eliminating $26 million in funding for grassroots groups that help people sign up for health care through the Affordable Care Act. The 70% funding cut comes as part of the Trump administration's sustained effort to dismantle Obama's landmark health care program. President Trump has pardoned Dwight Hammond and his son Stephen Hammond, two Oregon cattle ranchers who were convicted in 2012 of committing arson on federal lands. Prosecutors say the Hammonds set the fires to cover up their illegal deer poaching. Their convictions spark armed right-wing militiamen, led by Ammon Bundy, to take over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, provoking a 41-day armed standoff in 2016. The British Information Commissioner's office has slapped Facebook with a $660,000 fine, the maximum penalty allowed for Facebook's role in allowing Cambridge Analytica to harvest the information of up to 87 million people without their permission, as part of an effort to sway voters to support President Donald Trump. Meanwhile, Facebook is also facing accusations that it's violating people's privacy with its use of facial recognition tools, which scans people's faces and photos even when people have turned off the facial recognition setting. In Pakistan, at least 20 people were killed in a suicide attack targeting an election rally for an anti-Taliban political party in the northwest city of Peshawar. The Pakistani Taliban have claimed responsibility for the attack. Among the victims was a candidate for provincial assembly who'd been running in the upcoming elections on July 25th. The UN Security Council is expected to vote later this week on whether to impose an arms embargo against South Sudan following a UN report outlining potential war crimes committed by government forces this past spring. This is Ravina Shamdasani of the UN Human Rights Office.
We found that between the 16th of April and the 24th of May, at least 232 civilians were killed, and many more were injured in attacks by government and allied forces and armed youth on these villages in opposition-controlled areas in Mayandit and Lir. The report also documents the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, with at least 120 women and girls raped or gang-raped, including children as young as 4. One 20-year-old woman was still bleeding from childbirth when she was raped.
In Ireland, the Upper House of Parliament will vote on legislation today that would make it illegal to purchase goods and services from Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. The bill has support from the second-largest party in the Irish Parliament, as well as the opposition parties Labour and Sinn Féin. Both American Airlines and Starbucks have announced plans to eliminate plastic straws after sustained campaigns by environmentalists demanding companies reduce plastic waste, which is contaminating the oceans and contributing to the global pollution crisis. Starbucks says it will do the elimination by 2020. In New York City, dozens of people rallied outside the National Homeland Security Conference, the largest annual gathering of DHS officials and private security contractors, including those profiting off mass deportation and family detention. This is Sarah O'Lee, one of the protesters.
We are in New York City against the National Homeland Security Conference being here hosted in our city, and to call out Bill de Blasio for being a keynote speaker. He says that he supports our sanctuary city here in New York, but we know that the NYPD continues to collaborate with ICE and target non-citizens who are here in New York. And in Nevada, a pharmaceutical company has sued to stop tonight's scheduled execution of Scott Dozier, saying the Nevada Department of Corrections illegally obtained its drug midazolam and that the sedative is not approved for use in executions. Nevada officials plan to use an untested 3-drug cocktail, including midazolam and the painkiller fentanyl, which has never before been used in an execution in the United States. We'll go to Nevada for more on the story later in the broadcast. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The Trump administration failed to meet a court-imposed deadline Tuesday to reunite all children under the age of 5 who were separated from their parents at the border. According to the government, just 38 children out of the 102 children under the age of 5 have been reunited with their parents. Attorney Lee Gallant of the American Civil Liberties Union criticized the Trump administration for missing the deadline.
We are extremely disappointed that the government looks like they're not going to reunify all the eligible children today, and that they have not even tracked down the removed parents. But we do think since the judge became involved in the compliance process as of this past Friday, things have taken a real step forward, and there has been progress. We are hoping that that means from now on, no deadline will be missed either for these under 5 or for any of the 2,000 plus going forward.
Over 60 children under the age of 5 remain separated from their parents, as well as nearly 3,000 children over the age of 5. On Tuesday, Judge Dana Sabraw reiterated that all separated children must be reunited with their parents by July 26. He said, quote, "These are firm deadlines. They are not aspirational goals." On Tuesday night, Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar told CNN the United States was acting generously toward the migrant children.
It is one of the great acts of American generosity and charity, what we are doing for these unaccompanied kids who are smuggled into our country or come across illegally.
Secretary Azar went on to explain the delays in reuniting the other children with their parents.
We could put children back with individuals who are murderers, kidnappers, rapists, or are not their parents, but we've worked with the court to ensure that we do our duty, which is to protect child welfare and ensure that they are in fact that. I could release all of the kids by 10:55 p.m., but I don't think you want that. I know the court doesn't want that.
We're joined right now by two guests. Loami Creel is an immigration reporter for the Houston Chronicle, joining us from Houston. And Barbara Hines is an immigration lawyer and founder of the University of Texas Immigration Law Clinic. She's worked on immigration issues in Texas, including cases involving immigrant parents separated from their children, and will tell us the story of Flores, the Flores settlement. But we're going to Loami Creel in Houston first. Loami, you told the story of a woman who you witnessed in court just last week or the week before, who was raped by 2 police officers. Can you repeat that story here?
Sure. So I was in Brownsville last week and sat in on a credible fear hearing in the Port Isabel Detention Center, where most of the separated parents are being held. And all of the women in this hearing had already had their credible fear interviews denied, which is the first step to getting asylum. And they were asking the judge to reconsider their claims. One of the women was this mother who told the judge that she had been raped by police officers in the country where she's from in Central America, and that she was coming here to ask for asylum because they threatened to kill her and her family. She came here with 4 of her children, including one she was still breastfeeding. And when Border Patrol agents found her, they prosecuted the mom for coming here illegally and took away her children, placing them in foster care. And at the hearing last week, she told the judge that she had been unable to articulate her asylum claim because she was so upset about her separated children and not knowing where they were. And she said she had yet been able to hear anything about them. The judge eventually decided, he sternly questioned her, but eventually told her that he was going to give her another chance to make her asylum claim. But as of last week, she still had not heard from her children, and we don't know if she's been reunited with them yet at this point.
So, Loami, does that mean that the immigration officials separated her children from her before they even conducted an interview with her? Could you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, that is how the process seems to have worked. Border Patrol, when they were doing this policy, Border Patrol agents would decide to separate the parents and the children and would prosecute the parents, who would usually serve a few days in prison before going to immigration detention, and that's where they had the opportunity to make their asylum claim.
And was there any, during the proceeding, was there any indication of what kind of paperwork, if any, ICE officials gave or Border Patrol gave to the mother about where the children were being sent?
That didn't come up in the hearing, but we know just from other parents I've spoken to, they sometimes were just told their children were going to Texas or to Florida, and sometimes they were given a 1-800 number for the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is in charge of these immigrant children. But they complained that the 1-800 number they couldn't always get through on it, or that the agency often required a number to call back, which parents in detention often didn't have. So it was really difficult for them to find out the whereabouts of their children.
Speaking to CNN Tuesday evening, Secretary of Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar said 38 children have been reunited and explained the delays in reuniting the other children with their parents.
The remaining ones are children whose parents didn't confirm to be parents. They were lying about being parents. They're demonstrably unfit. We've got one alleged to be a murderer, one who's a kidnapper, one rapist, one who's a trafficker, one alleged by the child to be a child abuser. We've got another 23 who are unavailable because they're in Marshals Service custody or jails or have been deported. And then finally, another 25 where we have not yet completed the parent checks or the criminal background checks, or they have been released into the interior of the country. And we continue to work very collaboratively with the court on all of these. Our central mission is protecting child welfare while still reuniting families.
Brownsville Mayor Tony Martinez was also on CNN. He refuted Azar's claims in an interview with Erin Burnett.
That's not the information I got, and I basically went straight to the coordinator of the entire Southwest Keys, and according to the information I got, and like I said, I've been there, they claim to be able to have all the information necessary and ready to go. But for whatever reason, it becomes somewhat out of their control as to how they go from here on out. So there may be a miscommunication somewhere, but I felt like I got a good answer from the executive director of Southwest Keys and saying we're ready to go and ready to move on, but they're just waiting there in limbo.
That's Brownsville Mayor Tony Martinez, who said that Casa Padre, the Southeast Keys facility, said they had 36 kids ready to go, but the government wouldn't move on them. Barbara Hines, you're the head of the University of Texas Immigration Law Clinic. Can you respond to Azar saying this remarkable quote, that it was an act of American generosity that they took the children from the parents, and then Trump following up yesterday as he was leaving for the NATO summit, saying that these people shouldn't have come into this country at all?
Well, I find that statement incredible. There was no concern for the welfare of children. No one concerned with child welfare would take young children away from their parents. These are legitimate asylum seekers doing what I consider a really brave thing, looking for safety and refuge for their children.
And the fact that they only returned, what is it, about a third, a little over a third of the children on a court-imposed deadline yesterday, and still have almost 3,000 to go, which must be returned within the next 2 weeks. Can you tell us the status of this and your colleagues throughout Texas and Arizona who are working with these nonprofits that are trying to unite parents, even parents who have been released, who are there, who are desperately waiting for their children?
So our experience has been that the government has imposed all sorts of regulations and requirements for parents to get their children back. And what I think is important is that the government had no process whatsoever to take the children away. So it's very hypocritical to now be saying you have to have a police check and you have to have this and you have to have that, when there was no process whatsoever for the parents when their children were seized. So there are many women and men who have been released from ICE detention who are unable to see their children. They're allowed an hour visit if they can, where their children are detained, for example, Southwest Keys that you mentioned.
And also this issue that was raised over the weekend by federal authorities of doing DNA testing to determine whether children were actually the children of people who are claiming to be their parents. Do you know whether this has actually gone through or what the status of that is?
I don't know. I know there's been a lot of debate about DNA. And once again, that's an extraordinary, unnecessary process. DNA is only used when there is a significant or serious doubt about parentage. Many of the parents who have been denied the recovery of their children have birth certificates, and they have documents to prove that they are the parents and that these are their children.
Also, what about the whole issue of the parents who have already been deported? What is the administration doing in terms of them? They're just saying, well, there's nothing we can do about it now that we've deported them?
Well, yes, I think they're certainly not doing what I would consider due diligence. They were responsible for deporting the parents, and they need to find these parents, and they need to reunite them with their children as quickly as possible. I think it is outrageous, the idea in our country that you would deport parents without their children, parents who arrived at the border with their children.
I'd like to turn to a parent who's been separated from her child. A Honduran mother named Jessica told the BBC what happened to her when she and her 6-year-old son attempted to enter the United States 6 weeks ago.
They told us, you are criminals. You will be imprisoned and your kids will be given up for adoption. They yelled at us so badly that our kids got scared. They told us to lay our kids on the floor. At midnight, they came to pick up the kids. There was a mom breastfeeding her baby, and one of the officers told her she wasn't an animal to be taking her breast out like that, and they took her baby. They cuffed her and chained her in front of the kids. What they've done is horrible. I have no information on my son. It's been more than 50 days since I last heard of him. I call and no one gives me any information. I can't even sleep. I wake up and my heart is beating so fast. I can't even breathe. They told me my son is somewhere in New York, but no one answers the phone when I call. There are so many mothers like me that have no idea where their kids are and that are still in the detention center. Never did I imagine it was going to be like this, that they would take our kids. Our kids have no fault for the mistakes the adults make.
That's Jessica talking to the BBC about what happened when she and her 6-year-old son attempted to enter the United States. If you could tell me, Lomi Creel, how typical is this story? And are you seeing these stories increase or decrease right now?
I mean, I think from what I know, just from having talked to parents and lawyers, that story is pretty typical. I mean, that's what happened with parents who came with their children. Sometimes their children were taken away and they were told about it, or sometimes there were some cases where parents reported they went to the bathroom and when they came back, their children were gone. So, and also it's been very difficult, as she said, for the parents to find out where their children are. These stories, though, are not increasing. The administration has stopped essentially prosecuting parents who come with their children. So we're not seeing more separations. The question now is just reunifying all of these children with their parents.
Well, on Monday, federal Judge Dolly G. in Los Angeles dealt a major blow to the Trump administration's efforts to indefinitely jail migrant families, including asylum seekers. She ruled the Trump administration cannot amend the 1997 Flores Agreement, which says children cannot be jailed for more than 20 days. Barbara Hines, could you talk about the Flores agreement, what it is and how it initially developed, and also the problems that occurred with it under the Obama administration, as well now as with the Trump administration?
Yes, the Flores settlement came out of litigation over the treatment of children in the 1980s into the 1990s. And it is a settlement that's been in effect since 1997, and it governs the treatment of children if they're detained. But the most important thing in Flores is that the presumption is that children should not be detained, that they should be released as promptly as possible, generally within 5 days if there's no facility in the area, if there is in 72 hours. And that they should be reunited outside the community as quickly as possible. And the Obama administration violated the Flores Agreement, trying to keep parents and children detained for long periods of time, arguing the Flores settlement, just like the Trump administration, does not include accompanied children, that is, children that appear with their parents, that present themselves at the border with their parents. And Judge Gee now twice has resoundingly rejected both the arguments of the Obama administration and once again of the Trump administration, and has rejected the notion that children and their parents can be prolonged, indefinitely detained, as Trump is now claiming that he needs to do, or what he wants to do.
Who was Flores?
Jenny Flores was a Salvadorian who was detained in the late 80s, the last time there were large numbers of Central Americans coming to this country.
And so the Trump administration says, I mean, they continue to defy deadlines. They say they did this. It was a humanitarian act, separating children from murderers and rapists. And now they say they will hold them together, want to hold them indefinitely, perhaps on military bases and other places. So what happens next? Can the Flores settlement withstand the challenge?
Well, I think the Flores settlement can withstand the challenge. The Flores settlement is the law. It's an agreement that the government entered into and has abided by for many years. Although, as I said, the Obama administration tried to get out of the settlement as well. But basically, Judge Gee said that what Trump is proposing is not possible under the settlement, and it's not possible under the order of the San Diego judge. So basically, I don't think that Trump is going to be able to hold families indefinitely. What's important as well is that in his executive order and in his pronouncements, he ignores the liberty interest, the Constitution, and our immigration statutes, which provide for all immigrants the right to present an application for release from detention.
We just have 15 seconds, but what about people who come over the border who don't speak Spanish even? The Trump administration says the border guards speak Spanish, but indigenous languages, Barbara Hines.
That's a very significant problem. Colleagues of mine met with families at the Hutto Detention Center near Austin, and they could not communicate with the indigenous speakers there. They were even more isolated than the Spanish speakers. They had no idea of what was happening with their children. There are not enough interpreters for indigenous, primarily Guatemalan languages. Even before this humanitarian crisis, the phone lines don't work in detention centers. There are not enough interpreters. So this is really one of the most isolated populations, and the idea that the administration would then take their children and not be able to communicate with them is, I think, illegal and certainly immoral.
Barbara Hines, we want to thank you for being with us, University of Texas Immigration Law Clinic. And Loemi Creel of the Houston Chronicle will link to your pieces at DemocracyNow.org. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org. When we come back, President Trump threatened to bomb Venezuela. We'll talk with Mark Weisbrot about Venezuela, the major protests that are taking place in Haiti, and also about what's happening in Brazil and Mexico. Stay with us. us here in Democracy Now! Studios. To see their performances and our interview, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the Associated Press is reporting that President Trump repeatedly asked senior White House advisors last year about the possibility of a U.S. invasion of Venezuela in a bid to depose President Nicolás Maduro and his government. Trump reportedly brought up the U.S. invasions of Panama and Grenada in the 1980s. The AP reports Trump's comments stunned their then National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster and then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who warned that military action could backfire. But then on the next day, August 11th, Trump raised the issue publicly.
We have many options for Venezuela. And by the way, I'm not going to rule out a military option. We have many options for Venezuela. This is our neighbor. This is, we're all over the world. And we have troops all over the world in places that are very, very far away. Venezuela is not very far away. And the people are suffering. And they're dying. We have many options for Venezuela, including a possible military option if necessary.
He was speaking at his golf club in New Jersey. We're joined by Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic Policy Research and president of Just Foreign Policy, to talk about Venezuela, Brazil, Mexico, and the mass protests in Haiti now. But let's start with this, Mark Weisbrot. President Trump threatening to invade Venezuela. The news just coming out from AP.
Yes, well, I mean, they've made no secret about their strategy of regime change. And Marco Rubio is probably the person who's most in charge of this. And, he has called for a military coup and other Trump administration officials. And this is really unusual. I mean, you can go back to the coup in Chile even in 1973, and which the U.S. was involved in, and many other coups. And they never said it before it happened that they were in favor of such a thing. And of course, the threat of military intervention is illegal under the UN Charter, and it's completely outrageous. But I think what's missing a lot from the news is the financial embargo that they already have in Venezuela, which is killing people. I mean, it is worsening the shortages of essential medicines. It's worsening the food situation. And and this is also illegal under the Charter of the Organization of the American States. And it's also illegal under other conventions that the U.S. has signed, the Hague Conventions. And yet, it seems like almost everybody who has a voice in this country is okay with that. And it's very odd because almost all the same people are against the embargo against Cuba, for example, but somehow they think that this is okay to try and topple a government and destroy their economy right here in the Western Hemisphere.
Mark, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the financial embargo, but yet the United States continues to import oil from Venezuela, and obviously Citgo has still a major presence in this country. So how does the financial embargo work at the same time that it continues to import the major product of Venezuela?
Right. Well, they don't have a trade embargo, but the financial embargo is quite deadly. So, for example, Citgo is not allowed to send a lot of money back to Venezuela. But even more importantly, they can't borrow. So they spent billions of dollars last year paying off loans. The government's paying off loans because they can't borrow. And this embargo actually prevents them from borrowing from the U.S. financial system or anything that goes through the U.S. financial system. And the banks, and financial institutions are very conservative about this. So even though there's allowances for a certain kind of, trade credits or loans that could be used to get food or medicine, they will cut off, in many cases, they'll cut off that as well, just to be careful because they don't want to get fined by the U.S. government. So it's a very serious embargo if they want to restructure their debt, which would be a very big part of getting out of the depression and hyperinflation that they have right now. They can't do that under the embargo either. So it's definitely, and they're not making any secret about it. Again, this is all open. They're trying to strangle the economy, and they're trying to overthrow the government.
So it was Tillerson, then Secretary of State, no longer. It was H.R. McMaster, then NSA, National Security Advisor, no longer, who were saying no. Neither of them are there right now.
That's right. And so you don't know what, else they actually would do. But again, they're committed. They're organizing other countries. This could never happen a few years ago when you had left governments in Argentina and Brazil, and even Santos in Colombia had taken their side on these questions of hemispheric relations. And so now you have all these right-wing governments, and so you have what is euphemistically called in the U.S. media the international community, but is really just the United States and right-wing allies trying to topple this government and using every means that they can, short of the military option that Trump himself had proposed.
And you mentioned the role of Marco Rubio in terms of influencing the administration on Venezuela. I mean, what's the connection there? I mean, clearly there is a large community of wealthy Venezuelans who fled Venezuela and now are settled in South Florida in the Miami area. But is that the reason why Rubio's so interested in what happens in Venezuela?
Well, he's got a whole, he has the whole right-wing program. He wants to get rid of all of the left governments. And so that's kind of the strategy. And, this is not really that different from the strategy of the prior 16 years under President Obama and President Bush. They did want to get rid of almost all the left governments, and they did take actions to undermine most of them, and they did get rid of some. And they contributed, of course, to the coup in Honduras, as you've reported on this show, in Paraguay in 2012, the parliamentary coup. You had, of course, the coup in Haiti in 2004. So they were able to get rid of some of the governments they wanted to get rid of and undermine other governments. They took actions against Bolivia as well. And I think the difference now is it's more open and more aggressive with direct threats that are really almost unprecedented in the last, 50, 60, 70 years.
I wanted to turn to Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, this recent, epic election that took place in Mexico, which actually relates directly to Venezuela. Here he is responding to a question about the approach that his government would take to the crisis in Venezuela.
We are going to apply the foreign policy principles of non-interventionism and the self-determination of a people.
Mark Weisbrot, you've written extensively about the new Mexico. Peña Nieto is certainly working with the United States in opposition to Venezuela. Talk about what the election of AMLO means, not only for Venezuela, but for Mexico, of course.
Yes. Well, for Mexico, I think, you're seeing, obviously, this election was the result of a 40-year economic failure. And, you have real wages are lower in Mexico than they were in 1980. You have poverty is worse than it was 25 years ago. You have economic growth. Just if you look at just the 21st century, of course, it collapsed from 1980 to 2000 like the rest of Latin America. But even in the 21st century, where a number of countries recovered, Mexico ranks 18th out of 20 Latin American countries for the 21st century in terms of the growth of income per person. So that, I think, is a real driving force, and AMLO has promised to do something about it, and especially for the poorest people. And I think he will deliver on that. I mean, the bottom 10% only gets about 1.8% of national income there, and it wouldn't take very much to improve their living standards in terms of redistribution of income. So I think he will do something there. But what you mentioned in terms of the U.S. relations, U.S. foreign policy, the quote you had about him respecting sovereignty and self-determination and non-interference, and he's also said, and his new foreign minister have said things about, not supporting hegemony or interference in the internal affairs of other countries. This is normal language for most people in the world, in the planet, and of course in Latin America. But in the U.S., foreign policy establishment, you look at the reaction to those statements, it's like hate speech to them to say that you're going to respect sovereignty and self-determination, because they've mobilized these right-wing governments. They want to topple the Venezuelan government. They've helped, they've supported this coup against, parliamentary coup against Dilma in Brazil and the jailing of Lula and everything else. And they have a whole plan. I mean, and when I say they, I mean the whole, the U.S. government, the intelligence agencies, the Pentagon, the State Department, the foreign policy committees of Congress. This is rollback time. It was containment in the first decade of the 21st century, and now they're going for the whole thing. And this is a real setback to them. And that's where I think you're going to see real friction, even more than on on the immigration and the NAFTA issues. You're going to see this part of the government, the foreign policy apparatus, and all the pundits, were horrified by these, again, these statements, which are not radical statements, about sovereignty and self-determination.
You mentioned that this would be more so on foreign policy than on immigration and NAFTA, but I've been hearing from people who came back from Mexico recently, who were there for the elections and were close to the AMLO apparatus, that there's been some discussion in the government, because or the about to come into power government of AMLO, of actually being much more aggressive in terms of reaching out to the Mexican descended community in the United States, because people forget that of the roughly 58 million Latinos in the United States, about 36, 37 million are of Mexican descent. It's by far the largest group of Latinos in the country, and that there appears to be at least a willingness of López Obrador to begin to reach out much more, not only to support Mexican nationals who are in the United States and subject to some kind of repression, but also to reach out to the Mexican-American community as well.
No, I think that's right. And I don't get me wrong. I mean, I think that's part of the reason he was elected. He was expected to and I think he will stand up more to Trump than the prior government did, and there will be conflict over this. What I meant really was it's something that you're not going to see so much because it will be more in the background, but this is a reason that these powerful sections of the so-called national security state will be against them, even if Trump decides to, you never know what Trump is going to do. I mean, the reports you see recently show that he seems to like AMLO. This could disappear in a day. But the point is that part is going to be there, and it's going to be a very important part of U.S. policy towards Mexico.
I also want to ask you about Haiti, where these massive anti-austerity protests recently shut down parts of the capital, Port-au-Prince. The protests began Friday when the government tried to dramatically raise fuel prices at the behest of the International Monetary Fund. Prices for gasoline, diesel, kerosene were to rise as much as 50%. But due to the protests, the Haitian government rescinded the price hikes. Can you comment on what's taking place? A few people have been killed right now. The various U.S. airlines have stopped flying into Haiti.
Well, in the 70s and 80s, you had a lot of these. They used to call them IMF riots because they were caused by IMF austerity policies. And this is part of it. This is actually what triggered it. You had this 6-month period where Haiti was supposed to make these reforms and in order to get a loan from the IMF. And this is something I think people here also don't know because it's not emphasized enough. But the IMF has this power in poor countries, and they used to have it in a lot more countries, where if they don't give a loan, then they don't get money. For example, Haiti was going to get money last week. It was approved from the European Union and the Inter-American Development Bank. And you don't get money from anyone else if you don't get the IMF money. And the IMF was saying, you've got to cut these subsidies to gas and kerosene and energy. And so this was obviously, you know, there's a certain rationale to this. I mean, it's not like these subsidies are progressive in terms of income distribution, but you've got, you know, half the country, majority country living under $240 a day. They're living in 58% poverty rate, and the economy's been stagnating for years. And so people are on the edge, and you can't just cut these subsidies. The government thought, you know, without protecting, people are going to be hurt. And so the government didn't do anything to provide for that. And they thought they were going to get away with it because they announced it right in the middle of the Brazil versus Belgium soccer match on Friday. And it didn't work at all. People were in the streets immediately. And, you know, here, I think you also have to, and you've covered this on the show, and you know this history, but, you know, this is a very disenfranchised population, and the U.S., you know, only 20% voted in the election that elected the current president in 2016, and they had to fight to get that election because in 2015 you had this totally fraudulent election that the U.S. was trying to force the government to accept. And, you know, so you have this history, this very long history, but even just since 1990, the United States has helped overthrow the government twice, and people used to vote in large numbers, and they're very, very disenfranchised now. They've really, I think our government played a major role in destroying what democracy that Haiti had.
But Mark, I wanted to also ask you about Brazil, where a legal and political battle has erupted after a judge ordered former president and the current presidential frontrunner, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known as Lula, to be released from prison as he appeals a corruption conviction that he says is politically motivated. Hours after the Sunday morning ruling, a second judge, a higher level judge, overruled the order. Lula remains in jail. I wanted to ask you how you saw what's going on there now.
Well, this kind of further makes it obvious. I mean, why is Lula in jail? He has a constitutional right to be free on appeal. There's no reason to keep him there. You know, he surrendered to the authorities. He's not leaving the country. And they don't have any real excuse for it except that he's the front runner in the October election by a large margin, and he would win the presidency. And this is you know, again, this is part of a pattern that you see of persecution against the former left governments. Argentina, you have, you know, some people are calling it lawfare, but I think it's much worse than that. They're really trying to put these people in jail. The president of Ecuador, also former president, Correa. So you have this all over, and of course, to varying degrees, it has U.S. support. The U.S. Justice Department was involved in the investigation in Brazil that, you know, led to these charges against Lula, which had no material evidence.
And how was the Justice Department involved?
Yeah, well, they were they helped with the investigation, and we don't even know everything they did. There are people trying to find that out now. But it is, you know, you can see why people in Brazil see this as very unusual. I mean, imagine that, you know, Russia was involved in the investigation of Mueller's investigation here. You know, it's inherently suspicious. But I want to say, just I hope, you know.
We just have 30 seconds, Mark.
Yeah. Okay. So this is this is one thing I want to say that people don't think this is all hopeless. You know, you do have the 76-member Progressive Caucus in the U.S. Congress that has taken very strong positions. There's a letter circulating right now in Congress that's calling for the release of Lula. And they put out a statement, congratulated AMLO on his victory and supporting this kind of foreign policy. You have people like Ro Khanna, who just had a piece in The Nation with Danny Glover. And all these people, you have a real force here that is saying that is clearly against any kind of regime change efforts, that respects sovereignty in Latin America. And this is a very big thing, and it's a very hopeful thing. And I want to make sure people understand that this is a major effort at resistance to these kinds of policies that we haven't had for quite a while.
And Danny Glover just visited Lula in prison in Brazil.
That's right.
Well, if people want to hear our interview with Lula right before he went to prison, you can go to DemocracyNow.org. Mark Weisbrot, we want to thank you for being with us, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, president of Just Foreign Policy. We'll link to your pieces on these variety of issues on Latin America. This is Democracy Now! Back in 30 seconds.
Cuatro monos y un tucán. Se los comprarán baratos porque en nombre del Estado es la ayuda que le dan a un guarara, a un guarao, a un guarara, a un guarao. El guarao, compañero, con flechas y cerbatanas, la tierra venezolana.
Mara here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Nevada, where a drug manufacturer has filed suit in an attempt to stop an execution slated for tonight. The drug company Alvogen, which makes the sedative midazolam, filed a complaint in Nevada's Clark County on Tuesday, citing that the Nevada Department of Corrections illegally obtained the drug for use in the execution of convicted murderer Scott Dozier.
Nevada officials plan to use an untested 3-drug protocol of midazolam, the painkiller, the opioid fentanyl, and the paralytic drug cisatracurium for Dozier's execution. Nevada will become the first state to use fentanyl as part of its deadly drug cocktail. Today's execution will be the first time in 12 years Nevada's carrying out the death penalty. Dozier, a former meth dealer, was sentenced to die in 2007 for first-degree murder with a deadly weapon and robbery with a deadly weapon in the 2002 slaying of another dealer, Jeremiah Miller. Last year, Dozier dropped his death penalty appeals and asked to be executed. The procedure slated to be carried out at 8 p.m. In Nevada at the Eli State Prison. For more, we're joined by Maurice Chamas, staff writer at the Marshall Project. His profile of Scott Dozier, titled The Volunteer. More than a year ago, Nevada death row prisoner Scott Dozier gave up his legal appeals and asked to be executed. He's still waiting. Welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about this case. First, talk about the man who's going to die tonight, who says he wants to die, the volunteer he's called, and these drugs that are going to be used on him.
Sure. It's sort of a strange situation and kind of a confluence of factors. Scott Dozier has been on death row for many years for this murder in Las Vegas about a decade ago, and he decided a couple of years ago that he didn't want to fight his appeals anymore, that he would rather be dead than spend the rest of his life in the conditions of death row. He's very open about that. He's very sort of articulate about his reasons. We've spoken at length about that. And what that decision set off was kind of, honestly, sort of chaos in the Nevada legal and correctional system, where having not carried out an execution in more than a decade, the state needed execution drugs to use in its lethal injection execution chamber. They had just built a new execution chamber that's never been used before. More than 200 different drug companies, distributors, manufacturers said they wouldn't sell drugs, that it sort of went against their company policies. This is an ongoing problem for many states that want to carry out executions, and Nevada is one of them. And the result was that Nevada then announced it would use this new cocktail that had never been used before that featured fentanyl, the opioid. And Dozier, for his part, said he didn't really care how the execution was carried out. He'd prefer the firing squad, he told me. But what happened was he let his lawyers sort of get involved in litigating over the pain that could be caused by this execution, and that set off sort of this stop-start court battle that goes back now to last fall and has sort of ground forward up to the Nevada Supreme Court and is now finally going to lead potentially to his execution unless a judge in Las Vegas today stops it as a result of the drug company's concerns.
You mentioned your interview with him. I want to go to a clip from the Marshall Project short video on Scott Dozier speaking about why he gave up his legal appeals.
My sister points out it's a lot like a terminal disease. You know, if he had cancer and told me it was miserable and he wanted to stop treatment, I'm not going to argue with him about it. And they believe me. I mean, my family believes me when I tell them I'd rather be dead than this. Not only do I love my brother and sister dearly, but I like them too. In and of themselves, each of them is amazing, cool people. So you know what I mean? There's no, there are very few people who I regularly spend time with. My sister is low-key hilarious. My brother's just one of the sweetest guys in the world. You know what I'm saying? It's, I don't know if I can talk about it further without getting emotional, but yes, we are very close. Love them dearly, dearly, dearly. Brothers had a real tough time with it. No one thinks it's a stellar idea by any stretch, but they all understand. I don't want to reveal. I honor their privacy in this. But I'm very close to them. They're awesome.
That was Scott Dozier in an interview. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned several states have the same problem of they effectively have not used the death penalty, even though it's still on the books, and so that these volunteers become the main way to the executions to go forward.
That's right. There's multiple states in which almost all or all of the people who've been executed over the last 20, 30 years have been these volunteers who give up their appeals. There are a lot of defense attorneys who protest this and say, we as a society have an interest in fair cases and fair appeals happening. We shouldn't let people sort of carry out what's effectively a kind of state-assisted suicide through our death penalty, right? We'll be watching to see how the Supreme Court deals with this. Justice Anthony Kennedy, who departed recently, is departing soon, has been a key voice in sort of restricting the use of the death penalty. It's hard to know where Kavanaugh will land, but overall, the court seems to be sort of interested.
Or if he lands in the Supreme Court.
That's true. Yeah, he might not. It might be someone else. It might be, but the sort of by and large, it seems like the Supreme Court is moving in a direction of allowing executions to go forward. They have overwhelmingly sort of said, states can try whatever they want. There isn't a lot of restriction in that domain.
And the midazolam manufacturer is suing for their drug not to be used in the cocktail?
That's right. Honestly, if there's one thing stopping executions in states like Nevada, it's these drug companies who don't want their drugs used, and that's what is happening today. The drug company Alvogen, which makes midazolam, the sedative in the cocktail, is accusing Nevada of getting the drug in an illegal way by subterfuge, was the phrase they used. And
subterfuge?
Subterfuge, like sort of lying to the distributor of the drug, right, about how it was going to be used, and now is saying that the execution shouldn't go forward because this is an illegal use of their product.
You were writing a book on the death penalty.
Yeah.
The significance of this case and the overall fight against the death penalty in the last 20 seconds we have.
Sure. The significance of this case is that it really, I think, marks a bit of a bellwether for whether states that for many years had seemed to be moving in a direction away from the death penalty, less executions, less death sentences, are going to maybe start things up again. And we'll be watching to see whether states like Nevada, Nebraska, others sort of try to mark a new chapter of using the death penalty more often.
Maurice Shama, we want to thank you for being with us. Staff writer at the Marshall Project has profiled Scott Dozier, headlined The Volunteer. More than a year ago, Nevada death row prisoner Scott Dozier gave up his legal appeals and asked to be executed. He's still waiting. We'll link to that at democracynow.org. Also, Democracy Now! Is currently accepting applications for full-time news producer position here in New York. Go to democracynow.org to learn more how you can apply today. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Nirmin Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Massoud, Trina Nadura, Nat Needham, Libby Rainey. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.